Welcome to the Climate Hive Show. What do you solve? Where we sit down with global game changers on climate. My name is Kevin Drolet, aka Kadro. I'm here with my co-founder and co-host Mike Higgins, aka Higo. And our guest today was at the forefront of building scalable greenhouse gas reduction solutions long before most companies were thinking about sustainability. Bill Flederbach, President and CEO of ClimeCo and one of the pioneers of global carbon and environmental markets. And through his leadership, his company ClimeCo is well known for its technical role in developing a diverse portfolio of environmental credits and for providing environmental, social, and governance solutions for clients navigating a path to a more sustainable future. And it's worth mentioning that ClimeCo is continually on the list of best places to work, which says a lot about Bill and his team and the culture they've fostered. So, uh, welcome, Bill. And Higo, please open things up as you do so well.
Right.
Yeah, it's the first question is the name of the show, Bill. So we'll get started with a underhanded softball here. So, when you look at ClimeCo, your inspiration, the world before, the world after. Why don't you tell us, what do you solve?
Yeah, thanks, Higo. Thanks, Kevin. Really, thank you for having interest in this topic and inviting me to this incredible Climate Hype podcast. When I started the company, I'll go. I guess I'm going to go with Higo from now on, since you're not Mike on this. So, Higo, when I first started the company. Being a climate scientist with some understanding of business, having gone to business school on top of my meteorology degree, I was really interested in and believed in that industry had a contribution to greenhouse gas and climate change, and I thought to myself, if I could come to the market with a solution that you did or didn't have to believe in climate change. It was okay either way. But I wanted to have a solution that we could install technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at scale and make it profitable for companies. So, really it started with we never led with a deck with a melting iceberg, and we did that's not our style. We led with a deck of that said, you have an asset here, and you may not even be aware of the asset, but we believe your greenhouse gas emissions are an asset that we can get ahead of before the regulations require you to abate your emissions. Let's go ahead and abate now. We're a market maker. Not only can we bring the technologies, but we can sell the environmental attributes that we're generating from the project and create a positive rate of return for you. And that's really where we started. Just earlier today, Higo, I was on the conversation with a project in at one of our sites in Texas, in Baytown, Texas, and that was one of our first sites. And if you look at a lot of our early days in nitrous oxide and super pollutants, we've done a lot more since then. They were conventionally in red states, in more Republican-led states. And thinking back about the history of climate, the Republicans have really been supportive of using environmental markets to solve problems. So it really makes sense that a lot of our projects were in states where, necessarily some folks would say, well, why would they abate? Well, they abated because they really saw the benefit of bringing a technology in advance and creating a positive rate of return. So that's what we solved is, scale. How do you get to a market of scale and create incentives to do that?
Well, I think that was the exact right thinking, and I still do, then and now,
Hmm.
because it has to be in partnership with business because it has to make sense for the bottom line,
Yeah.
for adoption, because then you ride above who's in the office or, what's happening in the day, because business is always about efficiency.
Mm.
So and that led me to one thought as I was, doing prep for our conversation today, and I really started thinking about AI and the infrastructure of AI, right? Because it seems to me that this might require a recalibration for some, big companies' expectations of when they would be, you know, carbon neutral, right? As
Right.
the enormity of the electricity required, the water usage, right? It's a big thing. So I wanted to ask your perspective on, AI is friend or foe?
Mm. Right, Dirk. I think friend, I think everybody has their trepidation just about it in general. I tend to think that we're looking at it just as a firm, as ClimeCo,
Hmm.
if we're not paying attention to it, we're going to be at a strategic disadvantage.
Hmm.
So looking at ways we can also incorporate it into our business. I think I'm more open to it. It seems like folks at my age, we're not afraid that it's going to displace us because we feel like we can't be displaced because we have a lot
Yeah.
of other communication skills that are important in society. But I think the younger generation, just the analyst level jobs, I think, when I talk to students at universities, in some ways it's interesting. I think they're a little bit more nervous about the AI revolution as it relates to their profession or what they were hoping to get into. The whole spectrum is interesting. I think friend or foe, from a climate perspective, I think initially one would say foe, right? I think the footprints of these companies are increasing massively. Next week I'm on the stage in Dallas at an event at EarthX with a hyperscaler and a TED Talk about why are the hyperscalers now focused on, more than just removals, which are like nature-based and direct air capture, CO2 removals from the atmosphere. And maybe it's important to always think about like, are you avoiding the molecule from going into the atmosphere first and foremost? And then once it's in the atmosphere, how you're drawing it down. That's kind of the harmony of our investment thesis as well. But a lot of the hyperscalers now are looking more at super pollutants publicly as a way to kind of get ahead of this curve because they're seeing their emissions increase and in the challenges of sourcing removal credits or investing in nature-based removal projects to mitigate their exposure. I'm excited that they're focused now on action now, which is scale around hydrofluorocarbons, nitrous oxide, methane, and other super pollutants. Here you go. It's important. So I think friend or foe, I think to the climate, foe, I think to society, to be determined. Hopefully friend.
So you started in 2009, and one of the things we met your colleague at GreenBiz, and she was like, "Oh yeah, founder of our company actually, was one of the founders of the carbon market, and you cut your teeth, and actually you focused on nitrous oxide, so you started on a super pollutant. I wonder if you can talk about both like the evolution a little bit of ClimeCo from 2009, where you started, and then maybe tie back into these super pollutants and things where
Right.
there might be a focus too much on one,
Right.
carbon.
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, when we started, I just think from a business philosophy, to know one sector really well, as opposed to a shotgun approach of trying to be everything to everyone. I think before I started ClimeCo, Kevin, I was with a global climate company traded on the London Stock Exchange, one of the early movers back in the 2005 area. And they tried to be everything to everyone. And what I learned from them is, I saw some technologies that we could bring to the United States in the abatement of nitrous oxide or a super pollutant. And we were a rifle. We weren't a shotgun. We spent years knowing that space, knowing the technologies, meeting all of the companies, partnering with the associations that represented them. I mean, if I was wrong, I was long on that project type, so I was in trouble, But we thought to ourselves, let's really focus, and so we became the leader of that space. Still in this day, globally, we're the leader in nitrous oxide superpollutants. So I think that was important for us. The bet paid off. But we had to make a market, Kevin, like to your point, right? And in fact, one of the individuals that we hired that's on our team still today, 14 years later, said, Bill, you're doing a great job reducing emissions, but how the heck are you going to monetize that? I have some, I can help you. So we had to create the market. We had to put a price on the credit that we were generating. And part of the price was you would think is bottom up. What's our marginal cost? How are we going to price it? Some of the early days, you were just like, well, what's somebody willing to pay?
Mm.
How does that correlate to our marginal cost? And so being a market maker, certainly was a challenge. But that became the foundation of ClimeCo then, Kevin. It became a positive cash generating business that we were able to, not go out to private equity until 2021 when I decided to sell shares of the company. Until 2021, it was me. And so we didn't have outside equity, and part of that reason was because we had a machine that was working. And so then we were able to reinvest that capital always for growth. And we reinvested it, Kevin, into different project types. Like I mentioned earlier, Harmony. Like I really believe in stopping the greenhouse gas molecules. It's cheaper to stop them before they're emitted than it is to draw them down once they're in the atmosphere. But we looked at other avoidance project types. We looked at methane to energy. In California, we had a really exciting 7,000 milking cow manure methane project that we converted to energy and interlocked with the grid on the P&G grid. So things like that, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of our project types diversified. We got into nature-based as well. We bought a nature-based company that we invest in afforestation projects. So the whole gamut. And that to me, like life is about harmony. If you eat sugar all the time, you're bad. It's tough. But why not eat sugar if you're also eating vegetables, right? Harmony. So I think we approached our portfolio that way. But then the company too, the vertical alignment of consulting, investment in developing decarbonization projects, as well as how we move those products to the market in our products team. So I think creating a vertically integrated company, so we controlled our supply chain the best we could.
Yeah, I have a just a follow-up question on that, just for clarity too, because ClimeCo has reduced 40 million tons CO2 emissions globally. Is that the current number? Is more than that or
Yeah, we just hit 50 million, Kevin. So
50
I think
million?
by the numbers, we're at 50, and that's 50 million carbon credits issued
Okay.
to date from all of our project types.
And so part of it, you're actually like I think helping to understand what is a carbon market. Like I think about, listeners to our show and there's just all different kinds of people. A lot of people might not be steep in it. I think, hopefully a lot of entrepreneurs and people that are trying to do work in climate that tune into the show. But can you help us understand a carbon market? Because it's not just that, you're selling something, but you've been involved you're looking at projects that are reducing or taking, GHGs and then turning them into something else. So
Mhm.
can you help us a little bit understand the distinction or where some people might not understand a carbon market?
Yeah. So a carbon market would start with supply and demand like any other markets. Let's start with the demand side first, Kevin, because that's always like the holy grail, right? Without demand, there is not a market. You can always find the supply in some ways. But where does the demand come from? And that could be a lot of different sources. It could be from purely voluntary. There's a voluntary carbon market, Kevin, that most of our business is in, which is companies voluntarily saying that they want to reduce their emissions. They know that what they're producing is vital for society, but they also want to recognize that they have this externality with their process, which is carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide emissions. And, so they've set goals, and sometimes those goals are set through NGOs or outside agencies like science-based targets. Amazon has a climate pledge. There are different goals that leaderships of companies can make to realize that, yes, what they're making for society is really critical, but they also have this externality, and they want to, but they also want to look at the potential liability of their emissions over time. So how do they get ahead of that? So a lot of this starts with voluntary commitments, Kevin, and with those voluntary commitments, they're always looking at our clients are always looking at ways they can decarbonize or lower their CO2 emissions within their operations.
Hmm.
If that's cost effective, that's where they start. That's where we always recommend that they start. Look at your supply chain, look at your operations within your fence line. What can you do to lower your carbon footprint? But many times, the cost of that is either very prohibitive, maybe technologies don't exist, or it's just challenging operationally. So sometimes those companies say, well, if I invest outside of my supply chain, if I invest in a project that ClimeCo is building, I would like to be the underlying investor. I would like to purchase the credits that come from this and apply it to my own ledger. So that's saying, yes, I'm emitting, but I'm also supporting reductions through my investments. And I'm transferring those emission rights over to my ledger because that's helping me achieve my goal. I realize that I'm increasing emissions in my operations, but I'm investing in reductions outside of my operations. And I'm taking credit for that. And that's something that the protocols now, like Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Kevin, just issued their guidance, and that's something called book and claim that they're now acknowledging should be in environmental accounting. Like, does that make sense if Higo, looking at his operations and he's, it's going to cost him $100 a ton to abate his emissions because he's got a very complex operation. But he works with us and he finds where he can invest the capital of his company to reduce emissions elsewhere at a significantly lower price. Still doing the right thing for society and for climate, just doing it outside of his fence line. And that's really where some of the fundamentals of the voluntary carbon market started. Is that's the demand, is companies that wanted to mitigate their emissions, and invest in projects, sometimes within their fence line, or within their supply chain, sometimes outside. For instance, Kevin, a lot of our nitrous oxide is at agricultural fertilizer production plants. So it's not atypical that a company in the agricultural space may say, I know that the nitric acid plant is outside of our fence, but they're making ammonium nitrate that goes into our product, that goes into the fields. So it makes sense for us. It resonates well why we would want to invest in offsets from that market because it feels right to them, right? So the story.
Yeah. Do those companies then, do they also transform? Does it give them more space in the transformation process where then, maybe financially it doesn't make sense for them to reduce emissions in the beginning, but then they find some ways to invest? Do they end up figuring out how to solve some of those problems down the road? Is that
Yeah.
something that you get involved in too?
Yeah, I tell you, the one thing that we want folks to learn from the process, but first and foremost, we always really mandate that they look at ways that they can use what they're learning to abate their own emissions, to abate within their own fence line. Look at their supply chain. We have programs, Kevin, that if you're going to work with us, you need to show measurable reductions within your fence line or within your supply chain before you can affix our carbon credits to your product, for instance. We want to drive behavior shift.
Yeah.
And it's only really when, it's so challenging to think within your own supply chain or within your own fence line that companies tend to look at ways they can invest to make a change now. Because at the end of the day, climate is a global crisis. It's not a
Mm.
micro crisis. It's not just in the areas that we live. What we're emitting today here in the U.S. affects the globe. So this is why trying to be efficient at where that dollar is spent is so critical. But we do strive, and I think there are standards, Kevin, like science-based targets that, if I were to generalize them, that would be, one of their mantras, 90% in order to get to net zero, to claim net zero under the science-based targets, approximately 90% of the emission reductions have to come from within the fence line.
Mm.
The last 10% can come from investments around removal credits. So that has a very defined
Yeah.
scope. Some could argue that's too defined. That's why some companies don't get involved with that standard because it's challenging for them to ever reduce 90% of their emissions cost effectively. So sometimes that's a market barrier for companies to decide to go with that standard. But I think that standard is driving behavior shifts at companies. It mandates it. So
Right. Right.
that works well in that case.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems to me that reduction is such a better strategy than offsetting. Because offsetting, there's still a release of the gas. You're just removing it elsewhere, but you're still contributing it, whereas the reduction is the way to go. But I think that that's something you can step into over time. It would seem to me.
Yeah. No, I think that's Mike. I think you're right on the money. Is that, eventually that's where we see it going as well. In fact, I would say where we really see it going is that companies are going to pay more attention to, I call it the nutritional label. Like when you're buying a food product, what are you looking at? Yeah, I gotta tell you, sometimes when I go to Starbucks and I see the fat content of some of those Danishes, I make a decision not to buy it, or I make a decision to, but I'm at least aware, right, of the label. I think products now are having a nutritional label too, from a carbon content standpoint. And as companies start to look at sourcing responsibly, whether or not it's your food from your local farmers market, or other products, you're looking at the carbon content now. And I think over time, the reductions that we're making, that we're selling as offsets, will ultimately be embedded in the product. And there may be a time where we don't need the offset market anymore, because the customers really want to buy responsibly and are willing to pay perhaps a premium for that decarbonization, though, to get a nutritional label off your next set of ski pants that said it was sourced with low carbon content. And until then, the reductions that I'm making off of performance fibers that go into ski pants may be sold separately, because the consumer just isn't there yet as far as their willingness to buy and their awareness of a nutritional label for products. So I think, but I see a lot of our largest investments are to say, let's not rely on an offset market. Let's rely on what we call as an inset market. Let's embed the reductions in the product. Let's not sell them separately, if that makes sense.
I
That's where
think
I see
that's
the market going.
fantastic. And
Yeah.
I'll tell you, to your point about the nutrition label, I'm seeing that in companies like Amazon. Like when you check out at Amazon, I'm a Prime member, as I think everybody is, right? But you have three options for getting something delivered, right? You can get it delivered like today, we come between 2 and 5, tomorrow, which is the standard free, right? But then they have this one that says we can deliver it on Saturday. And it's more energy efficient. It's a better green solution because they'll aggregate a whole bunch of little teeny stuff and just make it more efficient. And you can pick. So I think what Amazon is studying is, will people inconvenience themselves? Because heaven forbid I don't get it on Thursday. I'm gonna have to
Mm.
wait till Saturday. Well, it's
Right.
intolerable. But I think that they're doing an experiment to answer that you just asked, which is, will people either inconvenience themselves or pay a premium? What a fascinating question, you know?
And 100%. If I could just maybe expand on that, because we have a partnership with Amazon, so they are collecting data on that, and I would say ClimeCo is a signator of the Amazon pledge, so we like that standard and the optionality that gives us in order to decarbonize. So we're not only are a signator, but we're also a provider of the carbon-free badge that companies have to earn in order to have our logo on their product through Amazon. But if you have our logo on your product as a carbon-free product, it allows you to sell your product on the Climate Pledge friendly platform.
Mm,
Hmm.
So Amazon now has all the data, and I know Harvard Business Journal recently audited the data to confirm that on average across all of the different SKUs, there's a 12% sales lift per Harvard Business Journal for products. So the total available market for products is lifted by 12% on average once they sell on that sustainable platform. So I think Amazon is seeing the data that customers like us, perhaps, or others are saying, I want to buy responsibly now. But you have to earn the badge, and it can be more than a carbon zero badge. It could be a water recycling badge. You have to earn a badge that allows you to get that green leaf or that green logo on your product. You have to earn that. But coming back to Kevin's point, you have to earn that by not just purchasing carbon credits and affixing it to your product to neutralize it. You have to earn that by showing ClimeCo and Amazon via our protocol that you're decarbonizing your product every year a certain percent. You're not over relying on carbon credits to earn that badge. But Amazon is seeing it. And I think that's why so many customers are coming into that portfolio here go, and they're saying, how do I work with Amazon and ClimeCo? Because I want to be able to sell my product on that platform. How do I earn the right to do that?
Yeah. And Amazon is a an important gatekeeper in
Mhm.
that, and it's great to see that leadership. It really is, because that sounds real and meaningful, you know.
Yep.
And so we're talking about companies obviously that have sort of bought in. What skepticisms do you hear from business leaders when you're, having conversations about these things? Is it still that they don't believe it's a real thing,
Mm.
or I can't afford it right now? I'm not in a position to really take advantage of this. What are you hearing?
I don't think I hear as much as I don't believe it's a real thing. Um, I think a lot of across the spectrum, we may call it differently. We may call it, guess what? In 2024, there were 27 $1 billion catastrophes associated with climate change.
Hmm.
27 $1 billion events in the United States. So severe climate, one way or another, I think is impacting a lot of assets and a lot of individuals. So I think I tend to hear less of the debate. Is climate change real? I
Good.
probably, yeah. So I think less of that. I think we see it. I think, how we get to a solution is what's debated. I certainly there's been rigorous debate over the use of carbon offsets. No doubt about it. I'm in that space. I hear it all the time. That's why credibility, permanence, quality, all of that really matters because I think a lot of companies would say, well, why would I want to invest in that? What benefit does that do me? So I think that's where a lot of there's a lot of skeptics on how we get to our end goal. If the end goal is really just to reduce the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and drawing down as most as we can, I think that there's a healthy area of opportunity to do that. But I think in a market where, certainly during this administration where climate isn't a focus, I think one thing we have seen, Higo, is we've seen some companies kind of lighten up on their goal, is to say, hey, let's focus first on our core business. I think some of that is natural, Higo, when you start to look at, responsible leadership of companies. I mean, if they're looking at voluntary investments to decarbonize, they have to weigh that, with the economic conditions and what their EBITDA looks like, right? Are they profitable? Are they able to, manage their business in this environment? But we always believe that, staying ahead of the climate curve and not losing focus of what your emissions are and how to get ahead of that and look at those responsible reductions. That's really going to differentiate those companies in the long term. But
Hmm.
certainly in the short term, we saw some lightning. I've seen some companies, reset their 2030 goals, for instance.
Hmm.
And I think you're going to see that over time. But I would say in the last 6 months or so, I've seen a resurgence back again. It's almost with an understanding that this administration, it will turn over one way or another, whether or not it's another Republican Party or a Democrat. There'll be
Right.
term.
Yep.
But I think the world itself hasn't lightened up its view on the importance of climate, even though some leadership in the US has. And I think so if you're a global business, you really got to stay focused on the bigger picture. And that's a common denominator.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, ultimately, it's a partnership with customers, right? Whether they're business customers or consumers, right? And businesses are in business of selling products and services to customers. So that
Mhm.
partnership has to be there, and customers vote with their dollars,
All the time.
So if they're rewarding companies for moving in those directions, and those companies now have incentive to move in those directions.
Hmm.
I don't think it can be expected of a business to do things, that we don't then reward them for,
Right.
you know?
And I think that's a really good point. And I think where I saw and where I think the Amazon data shows is that the consumer now
Yeah.
that's the demand signal, right? Even when I just talked about the carbon market, what's the first thing I said is if you don't have a demand, you don't have a market.
Right.
But now I think the demand is lifting for sustainable products, and that's causing kind of the leadership of companies to say, okay, that's the demand signal. I'm hearing it. And what can I do to improve my sustainability story? So I think, but it has to correlate. It either has to correlate to energy savings, reduction of OpEx, or the demand signal from your customers. And I think we're seeing both of those prongs a little bit more in focus at this point.
I wanted to ask you like in this vein in this discussion because so just before like jumping on this call I read a piece and I haven't dove into it, but Microsoft basically saying that they're going to suspend, whatever the details of their purchasing of carbon credits. And they're obviously like a big buyer, they're a massive
Mhm.
company. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like sh the shifting, political wins, but also like as companies shift, and then to Mike's point about like AI data centers, which are like, hey, like how does a company like ClimeCo, and you leading it, like how do you stay on top of that and these shifts that are happening and still, be viable, um, make the difference,
Yeah.
and engage.
Yeah, but we're good dancers, right? You got to be nimble. So, I
Yeah.
I dance like a white guy though. Just ask my wife. But I'm not a good dancer. But I think being nimble. I just read that over the weekend too, Kevin.
Yeah.
It just popped up on my LinkedIn. And one of my comments back on one of the threads when I think the market was like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? Microsoft is pulling back. There are times when companies like Microsoft and the hyperscalers, it always feels like they step in, um, sometimes very timely. They'll almost step in where there's a void.
Mm.
It's kind of like when this administration kind of pulled back from the Paris Agreement and said, this isn't a priority. I started to see hyperscalers. Granted, they've got data centers coming, so their footprint's larger. But I started to see leading companies, leading Fortune 500 companies step up and say, we want to create a demand. We believe this is real. So I think there's always a leadership void that companies step into. I think Microsoft stepped into a really important one with respect to investing in removals. I think they set a signal. They set a long-term offtake structure that allowed people to build projects to create those removals and deliver them at a future time to Microsoft. It allowed banks to be able to finance certain companies because they had an offtake with a Fortune 100 company. So I think that created a lot of positive momentum. I think the concern that I read over the weekend about is Microsoft pulling back. I actually feel like in some ways a lot of companies ran towards removals over the last 3 years and got away from real reductions now of credible projects. Like, how can I make an impact today?
Mm.
So when I see the Amazons and their super pollutant focus and JP Morgan's part of that and other big companies are part of that, I think that's the pendulum kind of coming back. And I think Microsoft is doing the same, is my guess, is that, they're long now investments in nature-based. They served as a price signal. They led the way. Now, I wouldn't be surprised, Kevin, if their portfolio may be a little bit more harmonized and also include super pollutant reductions now because they've already invested a significant amount of money in removals. And I'm not even certain that article was accurate. I think there's a
Right.
lot of hype gets created, so I can't speak for Microsoft.
Yeah.
But I do see other companies in that sector, focus more on real reductions now with super pollutants to kind of balance out their portfolio because they've invested in nature and we need both solutions. But I don't get too upset with articles like that. At first I want to verify them. I,
Yeah.
I wasn't even sure if that was an AI generated article, but I don't think it was. So
Yeah.
I think it's accurate.
Yeah, and I totally respect that. I mean, I think there's so much information that goes, but I think your point is an interesting one to think about like, you know, there can be a gloom and doom. Like something happens, right? There's an election, somebody gets elected. Oh, the world's falling apart. But actually, no, then things shift. Like so now, you're kind of the greenwash greenwash, won't hold up, right? Like if you're creating when we've talked to a lot of, companies, and it's like if you're creating a solution that's going to be beneficial to the climate and solve some real problems, it also has to be a viable company. It has to have the economics. It has to do, and that's been forced. So take away the subsidy or take away the help, and then you got to stand up on your own. And there's a good thing to that because then you become very durable. And it sounds like you're saying a little bit, even if Microsoft decided, that's not, things will change, and then other positive things can come,
Yeah.
in the wake of it.
100%. And we can't just rely on one buyer. Being a CEO of a company, I can say if I've got too much accounts receivable with one customer, I know that's a danger and I want to diversify, right? So
Right.
I think it's great that the role that they served, whatever they continue to serve, I think it's still creating a market price. It's a market signal, which is important. You had mentioned greenwashing too, and I think one of the things that frustrates me, and I always say in our business, it's the extremes that always hurt us, right? Whether or not you're extreme far left or extreme far right, I like to balance it and be in the middle of the road. But sometimes it's the extreme far left that are attacking every claim. It's attacking every claim. And even some of the Apple won some of the that recent court case about greenwashing around the Apple Watch and ways that they've mitigated their carbon emissions associated with the watch and how they use certain projects to help mitigate that. I thought I thought cases like that, as an example, are really done credible. So I think that there was a lot of greenwashing at one time, but I think that the fear of being labeled a greenwasher is cripples leadership. So they want to do the right thing, but they're afraid to make the claim.
Hmm.
There are certain countries that Amazon and ClimeCo, we won't offer the Amazon Climate Pledge friendly products because of the claim issues in certain countries that are so litigious
Hmm.
that it's almost not worth trying to do the right thing. So I think there has to be a balance. Claims have to be done credibly, but I think it's the fear that's crippling at times for leaders to make a claim, which is why I see more companies now simply do the right thing and not claim it, because they know that no matter what, there's going to be a hater out there. So it is a little troubling in our space. I see it. I see the reason because the claims have to be done right. And I think as a company that works with claims across the globe, we have a group of people that just do that. Focus on the claim, focus on the credibility. What's the client saying? Can they
Mhm.
say it? But it's crippling at times.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting take. Um, I wanted to just also ask you about N2O a little bit, or the GHG versus carbon, because you wrote a piece about N2O recently, this month, and it's where you started. But can you talk about and situate like carbon versus GHGs for people that maybe don't understand this? And I'll give some context in that, at Climate Hive, one of the things we've looked at a lot is like what are emergency brake solutions, and that we need to understand what are the things we can do today, like you were just saying earlier, like what are the things we can do today. But you have a pretty depth of understanding experience of this, so can you help listeners
Yeah.
understand?
Yeah. I always say, we always talk about carbon dioxide equivalent, Kevin. CO2e. And why is that E there? Because CO2e is the common denominator that we have. So, like when I think of, for instance, nitrous oxide, nitrous oxide per the standards is 273 times stronger than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So for every metric ton of nitrous oxide that we destroy, the standards allow us to generate 273 carbon credits. So everything is traded on 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, right? So hydrofluorocarbons, which, like refrigerant R11 or R12, can be as high as almost 12,500 times stronger than CO2. So they're, at destruction, they're converted based on the ICP, IPCC, global warming potential for that pollutant. Everything is converted to CO2. Carbon black is converted. Methane, that changes depending on the analysis, but it's roughly 25 times stronger than CO2. So when we think about real action now, and that's where some of the focus has been lately, is that, there are sources of these high global warming potential pollutants that are out there. How can we get to them quickly and cost effectively? Which is why you're hearing a lot of this new term super pollutants, because, super pollutants are any that I just described. Some describe super pollutants as short-lived versus long-lived, meaning how long is that molecule in the atmosphere? But at the end of the day, they're all massive impacts that, what can we do today at scale? Which is why I think some of the focus is coming back to that, running back to that, because I think we're seeing that we need some mitigation measures now because it's kind of getting away from us.
Let me ask you a question, because you guys have been doing this for years, so it's always about what's coming. So, what's coming in the climate markets that businesses aren't paying attention to yet? Like, what will we be hearing about in 2027? Because I'm sure you guys are, onto that already.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big ones, and I mentioned it earlier, is this whole concept of insetting. It's working with the leaders of companies to, like Meta recently came out with a request for proposal looking at their data centers, Higo, and like what goes into a data center. Cement. Well, is there a green cement? Is there a lower carbon cement that they can procure?
Right.
Cables. Well, is there more a lower carbon cable? Is there lower carbon aluminum? Lower carbon steel. So I think from a procurement standpoint, it's coming back to the nutritional label. And we invest in the cement sector, for instance, and we generate carbon reductions from cement production, green cement. We sell those reductions as an environmental credit now, so somebody else can claim it without taking the physical cement product. If we can bundle that together and have one of the data centers actually buy the cement with the low carbon value attached to it, that's where I see
That's
massive
right.
progress coming up.
Can
Uh,
you give just a
Me too.
definition of insetting, just so I know you were
Yep.
describing.
Yep, absolutely. So that's really looking at, your supply chain of your product and looking at ways. So say for instance, my building had 10% cement usage. If I'm going to look at my compensating for my building, I can't take a cement credit and offset 100% of my emissions. I can really only offset the amount that that product contributed. So in that case, 10%. So now if I can source, low carbon cement, for that 10% of my emissions profile, I can use that as an inset. I'm looking at my supply chain. If I'm also looking at ways that I could source, maybe I can't get the green cement to my facility, but I can buy the environmental attributes off a green cement plant that's making cement 10 states away that I can't physically get to my location. I can then transfer those environmental attributes from that green cement, but only up to 10% of my emissions because that only contributed to 10%. So there is a lot of, real documentation of where's my emission profile coming from and how can I mitigate that within my supply chain and keep it there. So I'm not buying a credit external. It's got to be within the supply chain. It's coming back to that. How can I think differently now about mitigating my exposure, my supply chain? And that's really more of that inset philosophy, Kevin.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me actually wonder because many of the startups that we work with, they're planning on doing, carbon credits as part of their business model, but some of them are fairly early stage, right? They're early companies. Would call them like a startup or scale up. Maybe they're at a scale up point. But for ClimeCo, are you working? Where does a company have to be for you to work with them? And I know that you've also done some development work with companies that you see potential for. Um, can you talk about that a little bit?
Like perhaps like if we were going to look at partnering with them or maybe do
Yeah,
an
exactly.
acquisition or
Yeah, like where do they need to be and what
Yeah.
is the thing for you that says, yes, this is a company we can work with?
Yeah. It's a great question because I say we kiss a lot of frogs in our business, right? So we're looking at a lot of different technologies. I think first and foremost, from the company perspective, it's the people, the people that we're working with. What's their history? Do they practice what I always practice at my firm, which is the 60-minute test, meaning my pop taught me that like everything I do act as if I'm on 60 minutes. So if I'm uncomfortable being filmed for 60 minutes, I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
Hmm.
My pop loved 60 minutes. He passed away now. He's one of my amazing mentors. But just it starts with the people, foundationally, have they done the right thing?
Hmm.
Are they trying to do the right thing? Are they in it for the right reasons? I think once we get by once we're through that filter, then does the technology really have scale? And I think for us, there's a lot of niche areas that are really important and really important that companies focus on, smaller but really important opportunities. I think from ClimeCo's perspective, if we're going to invest in a partnership that could take years before we even monetize, it's got to have the scale too. So it's got to have the technology, it's got to have the people, it's got to have the technology that translates to real reduction, and then it's got to have a total available market that's sizable enough for us to say, yeah, let's do this together. Because I think at the end of the day, as a global player, we're thinking more like a wholesale volume. Like the reductions have to be significant. So I think that those three tiers are important filters for us.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. I'll have to do the 60-minute, incorporate that into my.
Yeah, that's
I
awesome.
love that one. We have that test in the company. We always call it that. Is it fair to all concerned? That's like a Rotary statement. I'm a Rotarian, but that's an interesting one as a market maker too. Like what you're doing, is it fair to all concerned? Is it the truth?
Yeah,
Those are core principles of Rotary as well.
yeah, no,
A
brilliant.
great litmus, no doubt. And that was such a good part.
Bill, is there anything that we haven't asked you?
I would say if I would have listened to, as there's a lot of entrepreneurs that dial into this. If I would have listened to one of the first person I spoke to about creating ClimeCo, which was an attorney I used to work with, and I fired him since he said, "Don't do it." He said most companies fail. So I knew I didn't want him in my pack, right? I didn't want him part of my tribe anymore because he was a negative thinker. And I think as I started ClimeCo, I would just say, Cliff Note version, it was bloody hard. I had to be committed. I have to realize I was walking away from dedicated income, probably no income for a while. But when we were prepping for this, Kevin, I had told you a little bit of a story where, there was a company out there that saw what we were doing, but saw that we were struggling. And that company had approached me and said, hey, why don't you just collapse ClimeCo and come bring what your ideas are over to us?
Yeah,
And I remember at that moment in time that their offer was significant and I could put food on the table again and feel like a contributing individual to the family because I wasn't drawing in any salary for a while. And when I went to my partner, my wife, and she said, Bill, do you really want to do that? How close are we? What do you think we need to do to make this successful and live your dream? I went back to that company and said, thank you for the offer, but I'm not going to take it. I'm going to continue doing ClimeCo and building ClimeCo. And so what their comment was next to me is what I use paying it forward. Is they said, well, if you're not going to join us, how can we help you be successful? Because we think you're going to be. And what I told them, and that was powerful, like it knocked me down. This was a big company that could have squashed me, right? But rather they wanted to partner with me, and all I said was, hey, once I sign this first deal, I'm going to have these environmental attributes 24 months from now. It's a ways off. But if you can put a price on that and even a prepayment on that once I sign the contracts, that's going to help me survive. And they did just that. Is as soon as I signed that contract, they essentially gave me a purchase for something I wasn't going to deliver for 24 months, but yet they trusted Bill Flederbach. At that point, ClimeCo was Bill Flederbach. So as I pay it forward, I always look at how can we help other companies be successful. If somebody did that for me, if it wasn't for that move, I wouldn't have made it. That was my line of credit that the banks didn't want to give me at the time because they didn't trust me. So then, now we built it, but we've done that before, Kevin, with other companies too. Like we really saw a vision where we wanted them to be part of ClimeCo and they just weren't ready. I remember one of them, I said to them, I said, if you're not going to join us, I'm thinking to myself, pay it forward, Bill. I said, how can we help you be successful? And then we helped them be successful. And then ultimately years down the road, they did join us. But they always reflect back at that moment when I helped them. So yeah, pay it forward. But entrepreneurial isn't, as you all know, is difficult. You're entrepreneurs, and your listeners are. But I say, believe and treat people fairly, and if you can pay it forward, pay it forward.
It's really powerful. I mean, Kevin, we need to go find that company that wants to invest in us and have a product in 2 years.
Yeah.
Put that on your to-do list. The whole question of don't do it, the thing that always pops in my mind is pet rocks. I
Mm.
remember in the 70s, you get a box and it had a birth certificate and it's a rock and it had a name. Somebody came up with that idea. And I'm
Yeah,
sure that individual said to their friends, hey, I'm going to do pet rocks. And they were probably like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
yeah,
And
and
of
then
course it took off and it was
it
huge.
took off. What was the other one? The
Yeah.
chia
Pets.
Yeah.
seedlings?
It's funny.
Or
I eat chia seeds every morning in my shake, and I always think about the chia
yeah,
growth.
the chia. I
Yeah.
just wish I had hair growth like that, but I don't.
Yeah, you and me both. But that's my go-to in my mind when
Yeah,
when somebody asks me, "Is this a good idea or not?" I'm like, I don't know if it's a good idea or not. It's
Yeah.
position, it's passion, it's the
right.
future. It's looking around corners. It's your commitment to the like. How can you ask me? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's incredible, right? And I think, some people say so there's certain things you can afford to invest in as a startup. So make your investments right. I
yeah,
think as you're building the brand, and building the organization, then, you have to shore up a lot because when you're entrepreneurs, you can't afford to do it all. And I think that's an evolution of a company as well. Like right now, just how we increased our brand strength, our communications team, all of these things that are so important to make change, but you couldn't do it all at first, right? You just had to focus on doing something good. Um,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
it evolves.
That's what I call the beachhead. You got to get a beachhead, and
I
then you
get a
pull
beach
through.
head.
You
Yep.
gotta find that ability to dig in a little bit and
Yeah,
have something that
100%.
you can build behind. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
What a fascinating and fun conversation, Bill.
100%.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I learned so much. I got notes all over. I can't even make sense of my notes. I got notes on notes, and of course I can watch the video, but I just get so excited about stuff. I lose my
Yeah.
mind.
That's so yeah, I enjoyed it thoroughly. Like I said, I told some of my friends I met Kevin and that was already a bonus and I like the chemistry of both of you. And I love to learn more, about Climate Hive, about what we can do to, further the relationship.
Yeah.
It starts here, it doesn't stop here. Uh,
Absolutely. We've
so,
just we've covered one breakfast, right? We
yeah,
have
one breakfast, man.
many more breakfasts. Mike, we'll find out Mike's favorite breakfast, and then
Yeah, let's Mike, where are you located, Mike?
I'm in Denver.
Denver. Okay. I think you told me that before. Yeah, that would be really great to connect. Another group, Kevin, that I wanted to introduce you to that I told you to is kind of that's the climate tech startup group, or it's not startups because there's really heavily involved companies too, but it's the EFI fellowship run by Chris Wedding out of Duke University. So you saw on LinkedIn, I was over there
yeah,
with the students at Duke recently.
yeah, I did see that. Yeah, I
Um,
gave a thumbs up on that one. Yeah, Chris
yeah,
is well, you were on his show too, so I actually listened to
I was. Yeah.
yeah, the podcast and yes, he's super interesting. That was also a very interesting conversation. So yeah, I would love to meet them. I mean, Mike and I, it's funny with Climate Hive, we've gone through iterations. So our fundamental thing is like businesses have broken pipeline architecture or strategic, partnership development architecture. So that's what we fix. I mean, we tell a
Mm.
story. But that's what we do is like connecting, introducing, and then helping companies to understand how to identify their go-to-market and their ICP. And a lot of companies don't know how to do that. And we've had success with companies that are outside of the US trying to come into the US market, right? And they want to understand it. And so that we've been successful there. And yeah, it's funny, I'll edit this out, but like, last year we had three clients or startups that didn't pay us, right? Or they didn't finish their contract. And that it's like you're doing a lot of work and we're like, okay, wait a minute. It's like I was like, Mike, I might have to get a job. Like, we're
Real
trying to
job.
push this thing along, right? Like, and we're providing value, but then it's like you have to pivot and figure out, okay, how can we continue to be helpful to like these companies and figure out, how to make also companies sustainable. But I had the same, chat with my wife and she's, was like, just keep going, it's 10 years, you know how it goes,
Right.
just keep, you got, if you're solving a problem, then, and the problem is real, like you'll be okay, right? And you got the
Right.
team. So, but
Yeah.
I just appreciate you persevering because you made a really big difference, I think, in a lot of people's lives, not just even in the sustainability space, but
Yeah.
totally been able to help
Thanks, man.
people. Yeah.
I think being able to reduce your variable expenses. I always joke. One thing I didn't say while we were talking is I own a commercial property with a vacant apartment. Well, what the hell? Why not move into my apartment and get rid of my house? I mean, the building already had cash flow from the other renters. Yeah. Guess what? I moved back into an apartment again. Who
Yeah.
gives a shit? It was cost effective, and
Yeah.
allowed us to reduce all of our external expenses to the point where it was minimal, and then I could live longer, right? My burn rate was lower, and I think that's why I do like to tell the story to the company at times. Is now everybody's a shareholder, we're more established. Let's not forget how hard it was, and never take it for granted, right?
Yep.
I
Amen.
love stories like all of these things that we share. They can
Mhm.
be really inspirational. That's why that first attorney, like Bill, you shouldn't do it. You won't be, it's not going to be successful. Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
um, I don't know. It's good
Yeah.
stuff.
Good
Well,
It
stuff.
is good stuff. That was my dad's advice though, Bill, because my dad was an entrepreneur, growing up, and he was always keep your overhead low
mm,
because because he just talked about your ability to focus, pressure, keep your overhead low. So, I
right.
mean, every vacation we took as a family growing up as a kid was a business trip that he was a show that he was going to, and it was like he combined everything and it was a great childhood. Loved
What
it.
did he do
He
as
was
a
beginning a computer manufacturer. He was in the software space. My dad did lots of
oh,
different things. And
cool?
yeah, first guy in his family to graduate from high school, college, and then got an MBA from Pepperdine. He was just a funny, driven, entrepreneurial dude. He
Huh.
was something else.
Hey, sounds like you had a heck of a mentor.
Yeah, he was a good
Good
guy.
stuff.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, Mike, do you want to do any kind of wrap end thing, or what do you
Yeah,
think?
sure. Let's just do it till we
Okay.
have it. You can
Okay.
decide what
Go
fits.
Okay.
for it.
Well, all right. Well, a wonderful conversation with Bill Flederbach, CEO, founder of ClimeCo. Just an engaging conversation. These guys, they are helping businesses move from intention to action and reduction of greenhouse gases. And they like it out. Appreciate that conversation, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Gabriel. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all you do.